Welcome to the Deep End by On Deck, a podcast where visionary builders, creators, and experts discuss world-changing ideas. I'm your host, Marshall Kozlov. Let's dive in. With the Deep End, we're creating a space where we skip the surface level and go in-depth into ideas that matter. I'll be your guide as we explore possible futures of commerce, higher education, art, governance, longevity, and more, with some of the most exciting figures in their respective fields. Joining me in the Deep End is Delian Asparouhov, co-founder of Varda Space Technologies and a principal at Founders Fund. In this episode, Delian explains why Varda's mission statement is to expand the economic bounds of humanity and how its success will do for space what the gold rush did for California. If Varda succeeds in building a space factory 10 times the size of the International Space Station as planned, Delian envisions that the downstream effects could expand the sphere of human economic activity to low orbit and then to the moon and beyond. And if the prospect of opening whole new frontiers of human activity isn't enough for you, there's more. Delian and I also discussed the emergence of a new generation of space companies he calls Space 3.0, why the most exciting startups in space have to walk the knife's edge between commercial viability and science fiction, the implications of 10xing or 100xing the number of satellites we have in orbit for the next 10 years, and why deep tech founders need to look more like Las Vegas party promoters than software founders. A note before we begin, this episode was recorded in front of a live audience, so the audio quality is a bit rough for the first few minutes before clearing up. At the end of the episode, we featured questions asked by audience members, including an investor at Village Global and On Deck's own Deep Tech Program Director. If you'd like the opportunity to get featured in one of our episodes, we're hosting another live podcast recording next Monday, this time about the metaverse and Web3 with Gabby Goldberg, an investor at Bessemer Venture Partners. We'd love to see you there and to include your questions in the published episode. To attend, visit thedeepend.substack.com. The Deep End is produced by On Deck, where top talent goes to accelerate their ideas and careers. We hope that those who listen to the ideas on the show are inspired to build. To learn more about On Deck's programs, visit beondeck.com. For show notes and additional resources related to the Deep End, check out ideas.beondeck.com. All right, let's dive in. Welcome to the Deep End.
Thanks so much. Excited to be here.
On the website for Varda, you all talk about how the mission of the company itself is to expand the economic possibilities for humanity. And in most cases, in the startup context, something like that would be lofty, maybe a little pretentious, maybe probably not even possible. But what's cool about space and the type of ambitious stuff you're working on is that's actually entirely justifiable and plausible mission. So can you explain what that mission means to you, just to start there?
If Varda succeeds, what other things does that actually enable to become economically viable? So, for example, plenty of people talk about this is not a new or novel idea about asteroid mining and how one could potentially do that, and how there have even been VC-backed companies that have tried to do, asteroid mining. Unfortunately, I'm in the camp of it makes zero sense to venture back, an asteroid mining company, because even if today you got an asteroid that was full of plutonium and, hydrogen and oxygen and helium-3, all extremely valuable materials for use here, on Earth and in space, and you put a massive asteroid and you put that thing, call it a quarter of a mile from the ISS, far enough away that it's not going to, potentially risk the ISS, but close enough that they can, go back and forth between the two. You could put that up there today, and it would still take us years and years and years to figure out how to make that thing economically viable. Like, what are you going to do? Like, send out a couple astronauts with a couple, picks and shovels? Like, we have no idea how to even begin to material process. And then, by the way, who's going to be using those? Are we going to be sending down the plutonium and helium-3 down on dragons back down to Earth and selling it back down here? This stuff is just so far from the realm of reality. And then again, that's if the asteroid's already here in orbit right next to the ISS, let alone the fact that you have to go out, grab it, propel it back down, et cetera. Those are extremely complicated problems that also don't really have a end market that would necessarily utilize them. However, if Varda succeeds and you have something that is 10 times the size of the International Space Station, that, by the way, is consuming a lot more materials than the ISS is, right? The ISS only consumes materials for, basically, food for the astronauts, and then replenishment of, the various, water and, propulsion and the various things it uses. It's a relatively, small thing. Like, it, can have a sort of resupply that's sent up every 3 months that, isn't a crazy amount of material. Whereas with Varda, because the, economic justification for what we're doing literally requires constantly materials going up and down, it means that we're consuming a lot more than the ISS is, even if we're a sort of much smaller station at the time. And so given that we're consuming a lot of materials, well, it's pretty expensive to bring the materials that we need for our factories from Earth. We're going to do that for the first many, many missions. But if we succeed, it then starts to provide that sort of economic incentive for somebody to start to go out and do asteroid mining and bring those materials to us and start to invest into that, because we would be a very happy and very large customer, for something like that. And so when we, think about the mission at Varda, when we talk about this sort of actually expanding the economic bounds of humankind, we think about the way to make a sort of, sustainable interplanetary species is not just by sending out, colonists. Like the way that California became California wasn't by Lewis and Clark arriving on a particularly large boat. It was because of the California gold rush, the economic incentive to go out there and make money and build infrastructure around that, right? And that a lot of the people that made the money were the picks and shovels people, not necessarily the miners. But that sort of Varda is the first step of the sort of equivalent of the gold rush for space, where we provide this very large economic incentive to start to produce materials at scale up there. But then the sort of downstream economic implications of something like Varda working means that there's a lot more things that now suddenly become into play. And all of a sudden you talk about, well, we're maybe expanding the economic bounds of humankind, from largely being Earth-based to being in low Earth orbit. Well, now all of a sudden you're talking about, well, maybe the economic bounds of humankind extend to the moon, or they extend into the asteroid belt. And so that's the mission that gets us really excited, every single day. It's not just this demonstration 3-module initial spacecraft that in some ways by default we're trying to take as low risk as possible and using technologies that already exist. It's what the implications are of if that succeeds.
So I want to actually start building off of what something you said, which is distinguishing between the science fiction and the reality when it comes to the space. Because obviously you're coming to Varda Space not only as a founder, but as a VC. When you look at the space at the VC level, what do you see as the opportunities that are reality-based? And what are things that people may think of in the conventional wisdom or the public discourse that doesn't quite actually fit? A good example you just gave, of course, was the asteroid mining right now.
Yeah, I think it's a very sort of difficult knife's edge to balance, where a lot of the times founders will fall into sort of one or two buckets that are working in this area. The first bucket, which is sort of easier to understand, is just what I call the pure, sci-fi based approaches. When, two sort of, Stanford fresh grads are pitching me on a lunar ice mining setup, it's difficult to understand sort of how that becomes venture backable. Because again, similar to sort of the asteroid example I gave, it's even if you somehow had the full lunar ice operation fully functioning and completely viable, and you had ways to transport that ice back into low Earth orbit, again, who's going to be using that ice? The ISS isn't set up to be, taking on ice, and none of the satellites that are up there are necessarily set up to be taking on ice somehow and using that as propellant. And so you have this whole set of projects that are, purely in sort of the world of sci-fi that are sort of easy to dismiss. And then on the other hand, you have people that are sort of taking relatively, let's say, unambitious approaches to, space. One category of that being, just being a sort of defense contractor or purely, contracting, to NASA, for some of their, research-based missions, which again, you can get some early revenue off of, but is never going to become, one of the largest companies, on the planet, or going to become a sort of massive VC outcome, especially because, NASA is typically a research organization. And so if they're funding you for a particular contract, it typically means that explicitly the technology that you're working on isn't commercially viable, because that is fundamentally sort of not in NASA's mandate, and it's rare that you can sort of find those crossover opportunities if your revenue is primarily coming from NASA. And so, for the first 5 years of your company, 99% of your revenue is coming from NASA. Well, then it probably means forever for your company, most of your revenue will come from NASA. And so the knife's edge that I'm talking about is the balance between these two that I think something like Varda lies on, but there's maybe a couple of other examples that I'm particularly excited by, where it is just difficult enough and just far enough into sci-fi that it sort of can potentially be one of the largest, companies on Earth, but is still sort of like pragmatic enough, near term enough that like you can actually fund this thing sort of, with venture dollars and in a very sort of like near term pragmatic, way that potentially also has some amount of DoD and NASA backing, but that isn't 99% of the backing, for the like first 5 years. And so I think beyond just sort of, in orbit sort of space factories, the other areas that I get excited by and the filter that I always use is just like, how can you make revenues within 3 years that are primarily from commercial customers? That's how I, filter, in some ways to check if somebody's sort of in that knife's edge, as, filter out the sci-fi. And then how do you also potentially become one of the largest companies, on the planet to filter out maybe just like the boring contractors. And so, one of the other ideas that I get really excited by is given that, we're going from right now thousands of operational satellites to over the course of the next 5 years, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of operational satellites. There are two areas in the supply chain of satellites that, need significant improvement. The first is what I colloquially describe as like the Dell of satellites. Like right now, in comparison to a decade ago, like you can kind of buy a satellite off the shelf. It's still quite expensive to buy. There's only a very small handful of providers, and it's not truly off the shelf. It's more like you can hire an external engineering team that's like built a lot of satellites. Your satellite's going to look pretty similar to the ones that they've built in the past. And so they're, kind of rinsing and repeating and turning the crank rather than having to, redesign and reinvent, from scratch. But it's not like there's a Best Buy where you can go purchase it. And so I think in the next 5 to 10 years, you'll see a company that becomes quite large that becomes this sort of like quote unquote Dell for, space, where maybe, today we're in these sort of, Wozniak and Jobs sort of like, Apple Computer Club days where you have hobbyists that are sort of assembling things by hand. But in 5 to 10 years, you'll actually, have a company that sort of mass manufactures these at scale at some, on an assembly line that looks like an automotive assembly line. And so because of that, sort of has much, cheaper costs and allows the cost of, buying a satellite to decrease significantly. So that's one area that I get excited by. And then the other area is, as there are so many thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of satellites in orbit, it starts to make sense to put up fixed infrastructure there, where right now, if you're trying to run like an orbital gas depot, there's just not a dense enough set of satellites that are up there for it to actually be particularly affordable for the satellites to fly to you, refuel, and then fly back. Versus as you just, 5x, 10x the density of satellites, all of a sudden that economic equation, tips. And so both, orbital refueling and sort of orbital taxiing, which I sort of both put into the same category, because at the end of the day, it's just like basically that satellites can, deal with having less propulsion on board. That's, an area where, I think there's sort of some companies that are sort of on that, sort of equivalent, knife's edge. And so there's a handful that have, been started and actually have decent levels of venture funding, maybe not from the Founders Fund, Coastal Ventures, Lux Capitals of the world, that are operating, sort of within that sphere, that I think are pretty interesting. And those are all within the sort of what I call the kind of the space 3.0 categories of it's no longer just rockets and people just sending up, satellites for internet communications or Earth observation. It's what are these sort of next generation potential avenues for revenue and building a space company.
Oh, that's actually really helpful. Can you define 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0 for space?
Yeah. So I would define sort of, space 1.0 as the purely, government funded days. So, starting from the early days of Mercury, all the way, through sort of like the space shuttle probably being the end of sort of space, 1.0. Extreme cost overrun, government bureaucracy, and again, incredible technological accomplishment, but never with any sort of like, commercial, mindset. Space 2.0 being basically like the, whatever 2005 through sort of 15 era, and, the primary companies being Rocket Labs, SpaceX, Planet Labs, Spire, right? And they basically all fall into, effectively, three categories. It's either a rocket company taking satellites to space, it's a satellite that's providing Earth observation, i.e. Planet Labs, or it's a satellite providing, internet connectivity, i.e. Starlink or, Iridium, as an example of a company that was doing this, sort of even before Starlink was. And so, those are what I call like just the earliest commercial use cases, right? When you're, trying to figure out how to make money in space, the sort of cheapest way to do so isn't by sending, I kind of like to joke, like, Varda is the first company that's trying to make money by sending atoms up to space and back. Versus, for the past 10 years, the only ways that we've made money is sending photons up to space and back. And the reason being that, photons are free to send up and down versus atoms, cost a lot of money to send up and down. And so, both in Earth observation and in satellite internet, you're basically just sending, photons up and down in the form of, radio waves.
I'm really interested when you were talking about Space 2.0 of marking 2005 as the start? Because I'm guessing that's a reference to SpaceX. But as I'm thinking about the space as a non-expert, aka podcaster talker in this space, I would think of post 2011 as, the space shuttle program winds down. Can you just really speak about what's happened during the 2000s and how that specifically shaped how we're thinking about the space now?
Yeah, I mean, I think there had been many attempts at, commercial rocket companies, and how even in 2005, there were multiple other launch providers that were trying to, work on this outside of SpaceX. It was just the first time that you started to see this sort of, and this is a, broader trend that has been happening, in the DoD that's been accelerated, honestly, a lot by Founders Fund, backed companies, which is that the DoD is starting to run more commercial-like procurement processes as opposed to purely cost-plus contracting, right? And so in traditional government contracting, the government comes up with a spec that it wants somebody to match. They run out and kind of run a bidding process. And then people say, yes, I'm going to build that for you at, this price. And then once you win the contract, then that price that you initially quoted is effectively kind of irrelevant. At that point, you basically just start to, book your cost to the government, and then they give you like a 10% margin on it. And so that's what's led to all these sort of like overruns, extreme costs, really long delayed schedules, et cetera. Because like, as a contractor, you're incentivized to just have costs go, over, since your total profit dollars increase the more that you let things run over, because you just get a 10%, margin on top of however much you charge to the government. It's you're incentivized to charge obviously as much as possible and let things go on for as long as possible. And so around that era is when, Palantir, and you can look up, there's, a couple of, lawsuits around this, and SpaceX had a couple as well, where basically you had a couple of these sort of early Founders Fund backed companies that basically tried to sue the government into changing how they would, award government contracts. And that fundamentally shifted both in the, world of DoD technology via the likes of, Palantir finding succeeding, but then especially so in the world of aerospace, where now, the Air Force had to purchase off of, capabilities, at the best capabilities and cheapest cost. But then also, as a provider, you didn't get to just cost overrun. You got a $400 million contract, and that was it. And, if you were able to deliver for $200 million, then great. Then you basically just had, better, margin than your competitor. And so the reason that I sort of, mark sort of 2005 as the era, much more so than the space shuttle dying, is like, the reason that SpaceX succeeded was not because the shuttle program got canceled. The reason SpaceX succeeded was because the Air Force decided to change their contracting process. Like at the end of the day, the space shuttle was like a NASA program primarily for the ISS, versus the early breaks for NASA actually came much more so from the DoD than they did from NASA. Obviously in the later years, especially with the Dragon project, which ended up really, helping the company, stay afloat for an extended period of time. That was really NASA focused. But the early days were much more sort of Air Force related and setting up a couple of, satellites for them. So that's why I sort of mark that era. And in some ways, now you're seeing the acceleration of that shift where, to me, sort of the latest iteration of this in the DoD area is, a company like Anduril, which was also, incubated out of Founders Fund, that is explicitly basically trying to say, now that the stage has shifted, not fully, but it has shifted significantly, we're going to create a next generation defense contractor that primarily just sells products as opposed to is just a contractor, right? So Anduril comes up with what they think the government needs, and then they basically say, here are the products that we're selling. We'll adjust the spec slightly for various use cases that you want, but no more so in some ways than a commercial customer would for a really large enterprise customer. But we're not going to just respond to a contract and then custom build whatever the government wants. We're going to build a commercial product company, and then it's going to happen to be that our primary customer is going to be the DoD. And in some ways, Varda is getting to benefit from that stage having shifted significantly as well, where we're just in approach. We're hey, DoD, we're building space factories. We're building some really interesting materials, and we're also building reentry vehicles that will bring those materials back down. If you're interested in those products, let us know and give us contracts to purchase the product that we're making, but we're not going to adjust our path, to be a defense contractor. And if taking that stance a decade ago, we would have gotten laughed out of the room. The only reason that it's possible now is because Palantir, SpaceX, sued the government into changing how they work, and then Anduril has showed that by changing how they work, the DoD actually gets a lot of benefits. And now in some ways it's totally flipped. For the first time, you have a acquisitions agency that directly reports to the Secretary of Defense, known as the Defense Innovation Unit. So typically, acquisition agencies are what the basically DoD uses to buy stuff, right? So there's the operators on the ground that say, "Hey, I need more Humvees," or "I need more bullets," right? And then the acquisitions agency is the group that then is responsible for basically purchasing those products. Now, typically, acquisitions agencies sit within the operational arms, right? So the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, et cetera, they all have their own internal acquisitions departments. For the first time a couple of years ago, a new acquisitions agency was formed that, rather than reporting into one of those operational groups, actually reported directly into the Secretary of Defense, known as the Defense Innovation Unit. And their explicit mantra was, find venture-backed companies that are developing products that could be useful to the DoD, and figure out how to find DoD buyers that can use that sort of product directly off the shelf, rather than having to go through a traditional standard procurement process where Defense departments comes up with the spec for the product. Instead, just find products that are already built that are close enough to the specs of what the Defense Department needs, and they're responsible for sort of bringing those in. And so that to me is the latest fundamental shift that in some ways is enabling a lot of these orbital refueling and space factories and orbital taxis. I literally just went to a half Space Force, half Air Force, half DIU, i.e. Defense Innovations Unit, this acquisitions agency that reports to the Secretary of Defense. They threw a in-person commercial space conference in New Mexico, whatever it was now, maybe 3 weeks ago. And it was just by far the most interesting gathering of space minds I've ever seen. There's literally all of the most interesting commercial space companies gathered with all of the Space Force generals gathered with the acquisitions agency that's responsible for helping marry those two. And so I think it's a really exciting time that is sort of predicated on all that work that honestly Elon and Peter did by suing the government several times back in the 05 to 07 era.
It's funny. The number one takeaway I'm getting from what you're describing, and it builds upon something Catherine Boyle said during one of our first episodes on the civic tech governmental space, is that it's not the sexy thing, aka, wow, the space shuttle is over. What's going to be the next thing? It's, hey, how do I have this knowledge of this obtuse seeming governmental contracting process that's actually going to build a lot of really interesting innovations. So that's just a really important thing to note. One last question on the VC side of things before we get into the specific what of Varda. You specifically called out SpaceX, Palantir, Anduril. Now, Varda, as companies that Founders Fund has done a really good job of working with in this space, what would you say are the broad lessons for founders or folks who aren't traditionally coming from a tech or startup background but have deep knowledge in the space? What have you learned from a Founders Fund perspective about attacking these types of spaces with those companies in mind?
Oh man, I mean, you're talking about history that starts from literally when Founders Fund was founded in 2004. So I'm not sure that I can speak super credibly to what Peter and Trey Stevens, et cetera, learned, but I will do my best to sort of parrot what I've heard from them. And honestly, a lot of it comes down to Palantir and Anduril were both founded by billionaire founders that could afford to go up against the behemoth of the US government and sue it and convince it that it was doing its job wrong. And so it required insane levels of endurance and sort of structuring the companies from day one, thinking through what is every single decision maker and every single person that could influence Palantir and Anduril's success. What are their incentives? How do we get in front of them? How do we convince them? What are the legal pressures, political pressures, lobbyist pressures that we can put on them to guarantee that something like this succeeds? And just expecting that it's going to take an incredibly long time for that to come to fruition and succeed. The quote that I always remember from Trey is for their earliest contracts, the reason that those things happened, even though they took and they obviously operated at a phenomenal pace, they went from 0 to 18 months and having a program of record with the government, which is basically a program of record means a sort of ongoing large scale operational contract where they're buying things that aren't just for a small research contract to check out what your company's building, but are we are actually purchasing things at scale from you. They went from 0 to 18 months in getting a contract signed, which you would imagine in the normal startup plan, it's oh my God, 18 months, your first contract. That's way too slow. Most enterprise SaaS companies have that figured out in their first 3 months. And even then, Trey talked about how The only reason it got done in 18 months was because of meetings that happened in the first week that they started, Anduril. And so they went into it, sort of very well thought out and like well planned. And so I guess, advice to like broader founders is like, man, do not try to start a company that, relies on the DoD or NASA without really deeply studying who has done this before and how they've done it, and then probably getting those people deeply involved in the company. And so that's partially why with the seed round of Varda, explicitly wanted to have the seed round co-led by both Founders Fund and Lux Capital, who I would describe as two of by far the best investors in this sort of like dual use civics, defense space, so far. And partially why we're really excited to also have, Catherine Boyle involved in this, Series A, is because she brings a sort of similar, mindset as well. Yeah, definitely. It is not easy problem to tackle. And it's also why, for example, literally he was probably our sixth or fifth employee or something like that. Basically like one of the very, very first people to join the team. Hell, even before I think the cash had even been wired for the seed round. Our head of federal at Varda, who had previously been at Stripe for 4.5 or 5 years total, as one of their early sales hires. So understood startups because of being at Stripe, understood sales from doing sales there. But he wanted to get more into aerospace. And so he realized that he needed to have more, federal biz dev background. And so he went and joined Zipline, the Sequoia-backed drone blood delivery and medical supplies delivery company, and ended up joining there and got them a sort of $10 million contract with the U.S. Marine Corps, specifically through the DIU, I believe. And so he was literally one of the first people that we recruited and brought onto the team. And we definitely would not be as far along as we are at Varda in relation to our DoD work, if not for literally having somebody that we hired from literally day minus 30 or so, basically 30 days before anybody actually started full time with the company, basically joining the team. And so this stuff, if you want it to work quickly, you have to literally start from day zero with having this. This isn't a like fresh grad is going to figure this out on the fly type thing.
Something I also want to go to is your and Varda's relationship to NASA. Something I really enjoyed when I was researching was the passion you were describing, the research that scientists and other researchers had done when it came to space-based manufacturing, but there was this issue with actually commercializing that or translating that into anything. Can you speak about that relationship and that work and how you all are building on it specifically?
I mean, yeah, if you study even the earliest days of, Skylab, or hell, even like, infographics that like NASA released in like the late 70s and like early 80s, they already talked about space factories almost identical to like what Varda is doing, literally with like the exact material that we're going to be working on, like the exact infrastructure. Like this idea is not whatsoever like a novel idea. It's been a matter of like, timing, execution, and like, pulling together like the right team. But like none of this would be possible if not for the fact that we're like standing on the shoulders of giants. Like the material, for example, that Varda is working on initially, which we are not yet publicly disclosing, but that initial material had a NASA funded research program that in I believe it was 96. They went on a parabolic flight on a 747 where basically they caused a 747 to stall out and let it free fall for about 20 25 seconds, which allows them to basically like simulate zero gravity down here on Earth. And so they actually ran this like very similar manufacturing process to what we're doing. And then literally the like Canadian Space Agency 2 years later followed up with a sounding rocket running a very similar experiment. Basically a sounding rocket is sort of similar to what like, Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin are doing. It's a rocket that basically doesn't go to orbit, but it sort of stays in free fall for 4 to 5 minutes at a time. And so allowed them to run a more extensive sort of research program. And then again, on the ISS over the past decade, there have probably been on the order of like hundreds of, at this point, microgravity manufacturing experiments done by various researchers. And so Varda would not at all be possible if not for the fact that this idea has been thought about for decades. It has been researched extensively on the ISS and by NASA in a variety of different experiments, both on the station and, prior to the station even existing. And so, all that I, did was study the hell out of all of that research and then think through, okay, well, the economics of this now finally makes sense as Falcon 9 is becoming very reusable and Starship is coming online. What team would you need, to do this? And talking to a lot of the researchers, there's two things that were necessary. One, you would ideally need somebody who has done microgravity research before. So you're not totally starting from scratch. And so thankfully, our chief scientist, Daniel Marshall, has been the principal investigator on several modules that have made it to the ISS. But then the other thing that a lot of the researchers were more wary of and not sure how to do independent of NASA was the reentry problem. Once you produce these materials, how do you actually bring them back down to Earth? Because right now, when you're on the ISS, you have vehicles that will bring you down regularly, right? You have the Dragon, you have the Soyuz, you have the Cygnus. There are ways to basically bring materials back down quite regularly versus when you're operating on an independent platform, you have to figure out how to get down on your own. And so, that's partially why, as I was sort of going out to recruiting for the CEO, I was intensely focused on specifically somebody that had worked on the SpaceX Cargo Dragon project, since that is the first time that a commercial reentry vehicle had ever been built. And so, Will Brewy, our CEO, was one of the lead avionics, engineers on that project, and was also head of mission control for 8 of the cargo ISS missions. So he not only built the vehicle, but he flew the vehicle and interfaced, with the ISS and dealt with the reentry process. And so I was like, okay, how do I find somebody that's not afraid of reentry? We'll just, recruit somebody, a CEO that's done reentry before, and then marry the two co-founders together. I've got a CEO not scared of reentry. I've got a chief scientist that's not scared of microgravity manufacturing. And I've got a, VC and myself that can, go raise the money necessary to go bring this thing to fruition. And so, I cannot claim to be the, technical architect or the person that came up with the idea for space factories. I just brought the money to the table and put the right people in the room.
Speaking of that, how was the feeling around, I was going to say around the office, but that's not really a concept, which is valid, I'm guessing. How was the feeling around the company when, after Jeff Bezos went out into space, he specifically called out space manufacturing as an opportunity?
Varda is an entirely in-person, culture. We're based in, Torrance, California, and every single person, works from the office every day, except for myself. I work there, once a month for a full, week, sometimes longer at a time. So office for us is a very determinate word. At the office, I'd say most of us have been aware of, Bezos has been talking about sort of manufacturing in space for quite some time. He hasn't talked about it in the correct way. It's clear that he hasn't, or at least publicly, he's not signaling that he's researched it extensively, since a lot of the times he talks about sort of taking heavy industry off of Earth. And I've even, heard him sometimes talking about cement and things like that being moved off. Cement production just makes no fucking sense to move off of Earth like that. Even if we have 2 decades from now, extremely cheap launch and a reentry, and Varda's super, super successful, cement's going to be the last thing that moves off of Earth. It's very low value, very high mass. It's actually quite easily, done down here on Earth, and isn't even that, pollutive in some ways. And so many members of the team have been aware that he's been talking about it for 20 years in some ways. And many members of the team are also aware that he isn't primarily really focused on it. Blue Origin's a little bit of a mess, has been clear with their various infographics, PR scandals that they've had over the past couple of weeks. So I'm not even sure that Bezos has the time to focus on figuring out how to do it correctly. However, I'd say we're all very grateful for the fact that, Branson and Bezos have decided to draw so much attention to space, and that it's quite easy to, get lots of PR attention for space factories while everybody's also paying attention to space tourism. So we're grateful for their PR stunts that have been quite beneficial for us.
I'm so glad you gave that answer, because that actually leads into the specifics about space manufacturing. So to go onto the Bezos rhetoric for a second, he specifically focused on the environmental benefits, hypothetically, of space manufacturing. To what degree do you think that framing is correct or incorrect? Because judging by what you've put out publicly and what you said sort of earlier, the advantage of space manufacturing is you're trying to do things that you couldn't do on Earth to the same degree. So I guess the real question is, why should folks get excited about this process? Is it the fact that you hypothetically aren't, releasing CO2 into the atmosphere? Is it the new goods and new ways? How do you think about that?
One, humans never make particular decisions unless there's economic incentives. And sure, sometimes people will put in particular government subsidies or tax credits such that you do things that are more environmentally friendly, even if they're not in your correct economic incentives. The government distorts it by making it in your economic incentive. And so at the end of the day, I'm just a pure capitalist. And so no, people aren't doing space manufacturing, and it's never going to happen purely for the environmental benefit. And also, there's not even environmental benefit moving cement off Earth. If you have to still ship the cement raw materials up to space, you're releasing a bunch of fucking hydrogen into the atmosphere on the way up, and then reentry on the way down. It's just it makes zero sense. The environmental benefit sort of space manufacturing is like complete bullshit. The reason to go, manufacture things in space, and again, maybe the environmental benefit in like 100 years, when you're talking about like, somehow actually being able to remove significant amounts of like industry off Earth and turn it into a park. Sure. I don't like to delve into like the world of sci-fi when like, talking about like what's actually going to be happening in like the near term. 100 years is, I think, too far out to be discussing, which is, kind of what Bezos's vision for some reason has been, focused on, or at least he talks about, in public. The reason to manufacture in space is there are a variety of different sort of highly sensitive and highly valuable materials that are sensitive specifically to the effects of gravity in their manufacturing process. And so maybe the easiest, let's say, example to understand is the bioprinting of human organs. Right now, if you'd like to get a heart transplant here on Earth, you're entirely reliant on basically somebody on a motorcycle getting into an accident and having an organ donor. And there's not really ways to bioprint down here on Earth, primarily because as you try to use traditional sort of 3D printing techniques, laying things one layer at a time, when you try to lay the cells of a heart layer by layer, because of the very intricate structure and very sort of thin ventricles, either things that are actually pumping the heart around, the heart, as you're starting to print it, basically starts to collapse on itself because it's only structurally stable once the thing is fully finished. When it's like halfway done, these very thin walls that it has and very intricate structures basically collapse on themselves. And why are they collapsing on themselves? Well, basically, due to gravity. When you try to bioprint something in orbit, you can create much more intricate structures and much thinner walls because you're in a zero gravity environment where the structure isn't falling under the weight of itself. So that is one example where you could significantly improve quality of life here on Earth. You could provide kidney transplants, heart transplants, liver transplants to people that desperately need it, and not rely entirely on the supply of other humans dying in order to get those organs. So that is maybe one of the easiest and most concrete examples for folks to understand. But there's a variety of others that have been studied on the ISS. Everything from rare pharmaceuticals for various cancers that are much easier to produce, to higher quality semiconductors, so you could have a more performant computer, to higher quality fiber optic cables. You can pay cheaper internet bills each month. Tons and tons of examples that have shown really promising benefit on the ISS with research that's been done over the past decade.
Something I'm wondering about is, and I hope this doesn't go too far into the sci-fi bit, which you've properly trained me against pushing into, is what is the difference between manufacturing in space to bring to Earth and manufacturing in space for space? Is there any bit of that is of interest to what you folks are working on?
The first one makes money. The second one doesn't make money. How many people buy stuff? Well, humans buy stuff, and humans largely live on Earth. There are not particularly many humans in space that would like to buy things that are up there. And so when you space manufacture for space, who are you selling it to? Like when people talk about like, I'm going to build things up there, 3D print, et cetera, it's like, okay, cool. Like you can 3D print like a wrench, and there's like 7 astronauts that will buy that wrench from you. Walk me through how that becomes like one of the most important companies like here on Earth. Now, to clarify, as things like Varda become successful, there do start to become more things up there that would potentially, buy things, up there. And so space manufacturing for space is a, niche sci-fi, interesting field of, research that, I'm glad that like NASA is funding for sake of like proving out technologies, so that one day when it's commercially viable, somebody can start the commercially viable alternative and transition that technology from, basically research in a lab into something of a commercial scale. Versus space manufacturing for Earth is a near-term, large-scale, pragmatic, commercially viable market, because it turns out there's a lot of people down here on Earth that are interested in buying human organs or semiconductors or fiber optics or pharmaceuticals. And so that definitely triggers my sci-fi spidey sense.
So given this, and this is another topic we talked about with Catherine a few months ago, how do you feel, and you got at this with your answer on government contracting, but I want to just make it really explicit. How do you think about selling products or services to government as the basis for a company like this? So for example, like you said, there's only 7 astronauts out in space, but those astronauts represent $1 trillion of governmental spending and all those different bits. So how do you think about the government as a customer in this space?
NASA's annual budget, I believe, is like $90 billion a year. So it is not trillions. Like you were talking about, like, their ISS budget, I'm guessing probably being like a third of that. And then the amount that can go into like wrenches, et cetera, like just, it's much smaller than you would, believe. This is not a like trillions of dollars a year type project. So where I get excited is you need to filter any particular space company by, do they have the potential to make commercial revenues within ideally 3 years, potentially maybe 4 or 5 years? And if government can act as a stepping stone towards that, then great. If government is the end game, not great, because that is not, in my opinion, a VC backable one, with the caveat of something like Anduril, which is trying to tackle a very wide array of products for the government across tons and tons of different types of hardware, as opposed to most companies are like, I'm just doing XYZ and I'm only going to do XYZ and then hope that one day a commercial market fills in. And so I think things like the Defense Innovation Unit, which I described earlier as that acquisitions agency that reports the sector of defense, they provide a much more consistent and reliable path for companies to use the government as a stepping stone to eventually be able to bring things to commercial markets, whether it's the government allowing them to de-risk the technologies or allows them to get to the level of unit economics that are necessary for more price-sensitive commercial customers. I do think that it is reasonable for, as you're taking deeper tech swings, to rely on that. And I think it's gotten a lot easier as a venture investor to imagine the government as the sort of stepping stone as it's become more consistent with companies like Anduril, et cetera, being able to actually show that VC-backed companies can actually sort of win government contracts. And I think in some ways it's a very exciting time for humanity as a whole, where the DoD and the government as a whole can just take deeper tech bets than what venture capitalists can, right? Like in some ways, let's say imagine that the DoD didn't exist at all. Well, I need my companies to make money pretty damn soon. And so it probably means that my timeline that I need for them to be able to have commercial contracts looks more like 18 months, let's say, rather than 3 to 5 years, versus because the DoD now acts as a stepping stone. Well, now I can start to think about, well, what are technologies that would be commercially viable in 5 years? And then can I convince the DoD that they should be the stepping stone because they will get so many benefits from this technology actually coming to market, and especially if it's controlled by a US company. And so I actually find that as a deep tech investor, this is significantly widened the types or the array of technologies that are now venture backable now that the DoD has become a much more consistent stepping stone.
Cool. So 2 last questions before we get to Q&A. Maybe you don't have one, but you referenced deep tech, so I want to break it up. Do you have a broader thesis, perspective, pick your wording around deep tech as a category?
The only thesis that I have here, which I'll parrot, from this is definitely Peter's thesis that he has repeated many times internally, maybe sometime externally. But it's that, and I'll maybe do it in a little bit of my joke way that I did it once on Twitter, which is the best deep tech founder looks a lot more like a Las Vegas party promoter than a social app founder, and a social app founder looks a lot more like a PhD of mathematics than they do like a deep tech founder. The point being that in the world of social or enterprise, you basically don't need to actually be that good of a fundraiser. You can just build a really great software product. And that if that works really well, people understand those businesses extremely well, how to value them, how to give them money, et cetera. And so you can be a really geeky, introverted mathematics PhD, and you can build a social app, I don't know, I'll poke on him, he's a little bit of a friend, but Nikita Beer is I wouldn't describe him as some phenomenal, crazy deal maker fundraiser. He's just a really great mathematician and knows how to build social apps that hack around people's, behaviors and get them to use it a lot. And then because there's such consistency in, knowing how social apps succeed, people are willing to, fund that quite easily. Versus a deep tech founder actually needs to, in some ways, you don't want to go so far as Elizabeth Holmes to lie about the underlying technology. We actually need to kind of look like Elizabeth Holmes. You need to be a very sort of captivating storyteller that understands how to translate the very deep technology that you're working on to a very broad set of investors in a way that is extremely understandable. And so that's why I make this joke of if you want to do a deep tech startup, you better look like a Las Vegas party promoter. You definitely don't want to look like a astrophysics PhD, because at the end of the day in deep tech, it's actually even more important that you're a really great fundraiser than in normal tech stuff. So that's the only maybe broad thesis that I have that, I'll admit is 100%, a Peter Thiel parroted idea, not my own.
I got to ask, how in this space does one become the equivalent of a Vegas party promoter?
Do as I do. I come on to talks like this. I tweet about the company regularly. I try to get coverage in as many different publications as I can. I am constantly thinking about what are the analogies and ways to dumb this down so that even extremely non-technical investors can understand what we're doing and understand how we'll actually make money. In this latest $42 million Series A round, 90% of the like work in getting the round across the table was making the economics of the business basically look like a lemonade stand, i.e. like anybody could come in and be like, oh, yep, they sell lemonade. Here's the cost of lemons. Here's the cost of like, the labor to, squeeze the lemons. And here's how much they sell the lemons for. And that was like 90% of the work. And then 10% was just continuing to parrot the same sort of space factory, et cetera, vision lines that I used sort of in the seed round. And then in the seed round, it was a lot of talking about sort of, some of the early stuff that I talked about around the, expanding the economic bounds. What are the implications for humanity as a whole if something like this succeeds? Why can this become one of the largest companies on Earth? Since seed tends to primarily be around vision, Series A tends to be around, execution of that vision and how will those economics work. And so, both for the actual fundraising and investors, it's really focusing on extremely, good storytelling that is, compelling and very digestible. And I'd say like our seed slides did a very good job of like, I spent 8 weeks, I think, in a row, basically almost entirely focused on just like iterating on our seed deck. And I would like go through the vision, like the visuals of it, and like down to each individual pixel of like, how are we representing a space factory and how does it look? And what are the like economics? Like, how do we like present this vision in like a very compelling way? And like iterated on it with like tons of investor friends so that I would like get their feedback before actually doing this sort of like formal fundraising process. And so spend a ton of time sort of on that storytelling. So that's like on the investor community, but then the investor community also feeds off of just like the public story that you're telling as well, right? And so how I can count, on many fingers how many times a Series A, investor that we were pitching would bring up, oh, I've been seeing your progress from the tweets or the photos that you're taking of the office or blah, blah, blah. And so, sometimes a lot of people critique me that will say, hey, why spend so much time talking about what you're doing at Varda, on Twitter? Isn't it better off to be more stealthy or blah, blah, blah? And I'm like, let me tell you, one, there's not going to be anybody else, I think, building space factories anytime soon, particularly competently. And two, the upsides of doing this stuff relatively publicly are so immense. And it's sort of difficult to quantify them because in some ways you don't start to see those benefits until you get behind, sort of closed doors. And an investor brings up like, oh, yes, this is super exciting. And then, by the way, I've been seeing the photos of your guys' office and how it's progressed and the number of people that you're hiring and looking at those profiles on LinkedIn. It's like, people, see that momentum and, can't help but let that, influence their, investment decision-making process.
And then the real last question here, especially because it's so tied into everything that you're doing, I think the useful part of the backlash against private space, a few weeks ago really was this sense from folks that they saw the public sector and NASA as just feeling particularly aimless in comparison to that 1960s, 1970s period that you were describing, even if it wasn't exactly commercially viable. I'm curious, what is your vision or perspective on what NASA is and what NASA should be doing, given the ability of companies like Varda to develop in ways that wasn't possible in the 60s and 70s?
At the end of the day, the DoD and especially a research institution like NASA should be focused on the like furthest edge of technological bounds, right? Like what NASA has done phenomenally well. If you study it from basically like, as the Apollo program started to wind down, you study, the sort of like 80s onward, human spaceflight has been like a complete disaster, huge cost overruns, limited, technological benefits, limited technological advances. And part of that has been because they focus on sort of, cost plus contracting there. And it comes down in some ways to like, the methodology of the contracting versus if you look at like the robotic exploration side of NASA, where they focus still on more like, we're going to sort of buy products off the shelf. It's going to be more, sort of spec based and, going to be pushing the bounds of technology explicitly far more so and taking more risk because, rover crashes or something like that doesn't really matter. You're not losing human life. That's where like, sort of NASA's fundamental spirit, I think, has been extremely well preserved. Like, look at it. We have flown by every single planet in the solar system. We have, multiple satellites that have gone around Jupiter. We have multiple rovers that are currently operational on Mars, right? And have landed in like crazy landing schemas. Like, 3 minutes of terror are an insane landing sequence. Like you're doing retropropulsive boosting with like a cable that you're lowering the rover down to, and then like you're releasing the rover and then like, going off and flying off in the distance. Like that technology is absolutely crazy. And so basically I hope that like NASA sort of refocuses on where it does best, which is like taking more risk, which typically involves not humans, and deep technological like risks. And so it's been really exciting to see because of, SpaceX's success, you're now starting to see programs like the heavy launch system or like the lunar lander start to have far greater capabilities with much cheaper prices. And so it's opened up where like now NASA's starting to like invest significantly into like nuclear propulsion. And I'm like, hell yeah, like nuclear propulsion. Like this is the thing that will like unlock tremendous like human space exploration, like it'll have commercial benefits for here down on Earth. And this is like the perfect NASA project. It's like unmanned, it's technologically risky, it's deep research. It'll take tons and tons of like money and resources and engineers like no commercial provider could ever afford to do. Like that is what NASA is really great at. Are they great at like maintaining a human-based space station, research station down in low Earth orbit that like is unfortunately relying on like decades old technology because like the ISS was built so long ago? That's where I get less excited. And so I hope to start to see some of the budget that is spent towards sort of like human-related spaceflight spent more and more on like deeper tech and higher risk things, as opposed to right now. I think the balance is too far in the world of like lower risk human spaceflight.
Hey, Delian, this is Lucas at Village Global. So this is perhaps connected to your point on the founder's ability to fundraise and tell a story in this sector. I think Catherine Boyle has made the point of, the importance of founders being able to sell the government and have the ability of going through the procurement process and how unique that is and different that is compared to, just selling enterprise software. I'd be curious if you share that perspective, or if you'd be comfortable backing the prototypical pure founder technologists, like in this industry, without their background, and how do you assess that?
Yeah, I think it explicitly goes back to, I don't actually think the best like deep tech or DoD founders are founder technologists. Like, I don't think that you want to be optimizing for somebody that has necessarily got the best technology, because the DoD doesn't just buy the best technologies, and the investors that fund deep tech companies don't just invest in the best sort of, technologies either. And so I think it's sort of related to both, where it's like, I'm actually at this point, I think, more comfortable with investing in founders that prove to be very good fundraisers and storytellers. And so those same skill sets typically apply to what's necessary in the DoD contracting process. And in some ways, more importantly, what's necessary to recruit somebody that can help you, bring in somebody with the DoD contracting process. So I think it's less necessary for founders to have that direct experience anymore. But that sort of, storytelling and presenting a really compelling vision being far more important than like the technology that they're explicitly working on, because the compelling vision will allow them to recruit the best technologists and recruit the best DoD, contracting folks that have experience that will allow them to eventually, become successful. So disagree with your framing of the question, but agree with, Catherine Boyle's point.
I work at a startup called Column based in NYC. I had a question about how can more people break into space, since I've had a fascination with spaceflight and everything. And so your Twitter has been a great educational experience for me and reading more into space. So I'm curious, how do you think more people can get into it?
Yeah, I think the best way is just like join a company that is like working in it. I think, people would be surprised that I was just looking at an old soccer buddy of mine is now like a launch director for SpaceX out in Florida. And his prior background before that was like he worked at like a brewery and like operations, like, the skill sets that you need to, join, especially some of these like later stage aerospace companies. You don't have to have like some, deep aerospace background in order to join them. Because at this point, these companies are large enough that they need like finance administrators, and they need operations folks, and they need supply chain purchasers. And like, there's so many different skill sets that they need that like the best way is like, if you do want to get a deeper aerospace background, take whatever skill set you have, and almost certainly, a company like SpaceX will be able to utilize that, and then use that platform to start to, learn, deeper and more space, specific, skill sets. Right. And so he now has, he previously just had like brewery operations experience, but now he does actually have launch operations experience that it is now even more highly valuable. And he can go from like a SpaceX type company to now a much earlier stage startup that can't necessarily afford to, not hire somebody with experience, versus SpaceX at this point is so large that they kind of have to hire people without experience in aerospace. Otherwise, like they just won't be able to continue to grow as a company. But it's, a lot easier to join something like a SpaceX and then start to, work your way down into, smaller and smaller startups as you start to build up more aerospace experience.
It's James Sinke here. I'm the co-founder of the Deep Tech Fellowship at On Deck. I want to talk a little bit more, or ask you about incentive structures. You've shown how that's absolutely essential to expanding the economic bounds of space. And we saw that through lobbying and essentially fighting the government, suing the government, Thiel and Elon were able to change the incentives by which we're actually get these companies funded and the DoD to work differently. What other incentive structures should we be focusing on changing that would unlock the next age of space?
It's a good question. The fanciful or farcical answer would be, I wish that, our world's, most brilliant minds weren't so highly incentivized to optimize which ads come up in front of you when you're using an app, or optimize which video comes up in your feed. And so fancifully, I would almost be like, well, if there were a way to somehow do the Chinese regulatory crackdown on boring companies like Google and Facebook, et cetera, and force them to pay employees less, just so that those people are actually willing to jump ship and actually do something with them rather than wasting away at FANG. And actually work on like actual hardware would be great, but maybe that's like too fanciful of an answer. I'm trying to think like, what would I actually change in terms of incentive structure within the space industry? Yeah, I'm not sure that I have a great answer. The thing that I always think about it, just comes back to like, world's greatest minds, so many of them. I mean, enterprise SaaS is kind of like this way too, where it's like, it's great that companies like Snowflake, et cetera, exist. And like, sure, they help apps, et cetera, like, run faster, but like, man, there's just so much money in Silicon Valley that just goes towards things that like just slightly improve some like enterprise workflow, or, make somebody's find and replace Excel, spreadsheet a little bit easier to use versus like actually like building hardware. I wish there's like a better way to like incentivize founders and VC to be investing more into it. And in some ways, I think like natural capitalistic market incentives start to do this of like, there's been a couple of like, sort of broader VC like trend essays that have been written lately, which is basically like returns are going to get squeezed out of enterprise SaaS as more and more companies start to realize that like, this stuff is actually relatively easy to underwrite. And so therefore you can actually just grow your company using debt or things like pipe, where you can actually, securitize your revenue. And then you'll not need to raise nearly as much VC. And so VCs will then naturally have to move away from things like enterprise SaaS, which has been their cash cow for the past decade, into just like harder technologies, because that's where the actual alpha is. So I guess like if you could somehow incentivize people to be actually willing to sort of take, more alpha in the investments they make. Anyways, that was a little bit long-winded. Not a perfect answer.
A good question to finish with would be, where do you suggest people go next for inspiration? Because something that you've consistently talked about is you've deeply researched and there's been all these interesting things. Where do you think are the spaces that you would look into if you weren't busy with your whole day jobs thing?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to dive more into aerospace, I think the best way to do so is just like start to dig into all I think people's view it as like, oh, it's like this, like, very large behemoth, et cetera. Like, how will I ever learn about it? And it's like, I basically went from like not knowing anything about aerospace to over the course of like 3.5 years, just by like consistently like paying attention to all of the companies, and then eventually getting to know all of the various CEOs, got to know all of the various players. And it's not like there's not an infinite set of players. Like there are probably less than 20 companies that have been founded in the last 5 years that have raised more than $10 million. Like this is nowhere near like an enterprise SaaS. 20 of those companies get founded every month, basically. And so it's an extremely like small industry. The best way to start to get to know it is like maybe 3.5, 4 years ago, just like followed all the space reporters on Twitter. So everybody from like Eric Berger to like Michael Sheets is like, 2 examples, Lauren Gersh. Those are probably like my top 3 favorite like space reporters. All of the various companies in aerospace now typically have pretty active like subreddits, like r/space, r/SpaceX, r/Rocket Lab, all of like really active communities. And there are always like really interesting discussions on there. Reading lots of like sci-fi books. Like honestly, like if you actually look at like the Varda business model, it's basically like perfectly articulated in 2 different sci-fi books. One that's more of like a nonfiction in some ways, like so maybe not sci-fi, but like sci-fi, whatever. The Case for Space by this guy Robert Zubrini. He actually wrote the book that eventually inspired Elon to SpaceX. And his book, The Case for Space, was helped to nudge me. I think thinking about Varda, but really helped nudge me even further into taking the idea more seriously. And then, Andy Weir, who is the author of, The Martian, wrote a second book called Artemis that actually literally basically has exactly what Varda is, like a plot device in the book. It's awesome. I was just like reading these sci-fi books, like sci-fi authors, in order to these ideas. Also, typically like read research papers and look into like what's actually possible to come up with these ideas. That tends to be like, just like change your information flow, like start to actually like, pay relatively regular attention to stuff, put this stuff like on your Twitter feed, and you'll start to learn more about it by default. And I think that's by far the best way to come up with, ideas around, things that you would potentially want to join or work on, or what the industry trends are. Is just like, get that information flow. And a lot of these reporters and CEOs of these companies that you can follow are the best way to sort of change that information flow. Go to conferences too. Like the other thing that really helped me a lot was like going to all of the space conferences. So like Small Sat in Logan, Utah is one of my favorites. Sat Symposium out in Washington, DC. There's just one in Colorado Springs too, called the National Sat Symposium. So there's a couple of different like conferences where like literally everybody from like Air Force, Space Force, SpaceX, Rocket Lab, et cetera, all get together. And like no better way to like learn about the stuff than just like by grabbing beers with a bunch of folks.
That's an excellent place to end. Well, thank you, everyone, for attending. We're going to keep doing these. Lots of great stuff, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us in the deep end. If you enjoyed your stay, give us a review on Apple Podcasts and share this episode with your friends and colleagues to help grow the show with us. We've also got show notes and more episodes available at ideas.beyonddeck.com. See you next time.